Great pleasure to introduce Dr. Aran Nayebi. He's an assistant professor in the machine learning department at Carnegie Mellon University with cross appointments in neuroscience and robotics. He received his undergrad in mathematics, master's in computer science, and PhD in neuroscience, all from Stanford. And then he went on to complete his postdoctoral training at MIT before joining CMU. So Dr. Nayebi, if you're familiar with this field, is really a trailblazer at this intersection between neuroscience and machine learning, where he uses AI to study the brain, but then also uses the brain as inspiration to build new AI algorithms. So it's a real honor to have him join us today here in Toronto. So without further ado, please welcome and join me, Dr. Nayebi.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction. It's great to be here. So today, the title of my talk is Using Embodied Agents to Reverse Engineer Natural Intelligence. And I think what I'm going to spend maybe the first few minutes on is to kind of break down what I mean by this, and in particular, why I'm emphasizing something like embodied agency in particular, and why I focus on natural intelligence. What's the goal? Let's maybe just start with embodied, okay? And perhaps for this audience, I don't think I need to convince anybody that AI struggles to understand the physical world. But just as kind of like a grounding example, so we're all on the same page. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Sora model from OpenAI. It's a text-to-video model. It's a very canonical example of some of the latest advances in diffusion models, especially text-to-video diffusion models. And in particular, what you do is you enter a prompt, and then out comes very photorealistic and nice video. And I remember around when it first came out, there was this kind of very interesting example here, where you kind of see this chair just pop out of nowhere from the sand, and then kind of as people are interacting with it, it's just kind of floating like it's in space a little bit, and then it like deforms in this really weird way, and then so in other words, it's highly photorealistic, by the way, but you're kind of like lacking a couple things that kind of go against our own like physical world model, which is object permanence and how we expect objects to move and react as we interact with them, right? It has photorealism, but it doesn't have physical realism. And sort of the question of that comes to mind for me about what's particularly missing here is this kind of need for embodied agency and interaction. So kind of the last decade of machine learning has primarily been at scale, which has been super valuable and vital. But kind of in this non-interactive, large amount of pre-training data setting, and this is part why you can get such amazing photorealism, but I also think the lack of embodied agency and interaction, as I'll kind of make a case for, has also been a bit detrimental with regards to physical realism as well. Now, the other aspect of things is, in my title is natural intelligence. And you might want to ask, well, look, we have large-scale data sets, et cetera. Why should we care about reverse engineering natural intelligence? Besides, say, like maybe the scientific question, and that on its own, I think it has merit. From a kind of AI point of view, you can kind of imagine that humans and animals actually have currently, at least where we are now, they perform behaviors we've yet to successfully fully engineer in AI agents today. And in particular, I've just listed a few of these things, which I'll go into in more detail, but things like prediction, which oftentimes requires a world model, which we were kind of showing earlier, kind of lacks this kind of physical realism, which is going to be important as you go and interact in the world. Planning, which requires not only this world model, but some kind of notion of memory and persistent memory, which is something we lack in current AI agents today. Adaptive behavior, and especially lifelong learning autonomy. So, you can imagine things like test time reasoning as really a special case and a kind of beginning of doing things at inference time and adapting at inference time. But there, the weights aren't updated. And ultimately, we know our brains, for example, are highly plastic. but they're differentially plastic. So they update in a way that doesn't lead to catastrophic forgetting where we suddenly forget who we are. Imagine if we did that to a model. You can't guarantee that certain core aspects of it will persist. You have to be very careful about the types of data distributions that you inject in there and the type of fine tuning that you do. And so I kind of think of the natural intelligence, or the role of natural intelligence, as kind of setting the stage for at least concrete engineering targets, things that we can kind of have as North Stars to try to work towards as the types of capabilities we would want to build into the system. So I don't mean maybe the more natural way of looking at the brain, which is look at every individual neuron and try to figure out the circuit motifs of what's going on and hopefully try to get something there. I think that ends up being too complex and too difficult to be tractable. But I think just looking at behavior and looking at the suite of things that animals can do can set targets for not only engineering programs of building better agents, which we'll talk about, but conversely, by building, what I'll show next is that by building agents that can do these things better, you actually also get a better understanding of the brain too. There actually ends up being a convergence, whether you wanted it or not, between AI systems that can do these kinds of tasks, these kind of more challenging naturalistic tasks, and having their internal representations actually line up with the brain without even fitting to that directly. So the canonical example of this in even like the most simplified setting is in vision. And so this was even from like, say, 10 years ago, where folks recorded a bunch of images, neurons, monkeys looking at images from their ventral visual pathway up here. And at the time, people were developing ComNets that were doing much better on the ImageNet challenge, on object recognition. And so what you can do is you can kind of plot the top one validation accuracy, just the categorization accuracy of these ComNets and their ability to their internal representations to actually predict real biological neurons in the visual pathway. And so each dot here you see is a different ComNet that's been optimized to do this categorization task. It has not been optimized to match the brain. That's done after the fact. And what people look at is the alignment between the internal representations of the models after they've been trained on the task with brain responses to the same images that the monkeys saw. So it's on a test set. And what you see, by and large at least, is a very kind of strong correlation between doing the task better and matching the brain better. So in other words, a convergence between an AI goal, doing better at, in this case, on this vision task, and a neuroscience goal of explaining more variance in response patterns in the brain. And you could ask, like, oh, is this an accident, or is it maybe representative of perhaps a broader, more general thing that we can take beyond just vision or this particular brain area alone? Because you could be like, well, maybe the neural data was weird in some way and we got lucky. But it turns out that maybe the deeper principle is this notion of task optimized modeling. And we can kind of think of it as like having four components that naturally correspond to what we do in machine learning, right? We specify an architecture class, an objective function, a data set to train on, and a learning rule by which to optimize those weights of the architecture for on that task. And each of these components actually physically maps onto some real thing in both neuroscience and cognitive science. So in particular, the architecture class kind of is a proxy for our notion of the wiring diagram, of how the neurons are connected to each other. The objective function that we pick is our hypothesis for the ecological niche of behavior that we think that brain area is optimized to perform over the course of evolutionary timescale. So in the case of vision, this would have been object recognition or categorization, at least for those response patterns that we looked at in IT. The data set is the diet that we pre-train on is sort of like capturing the statistics of the environment. So for example, it is quite crucial that we are training on naturalistic images to get this brain model alignment. If we were to say train on black and white images or maybe barcode reading or something like that, that's a task, that's a vision task, but those statistics actually end up yielding models that match less well to the brain. So matching those kind of natural statistics that the brain is optimized for ends up yielding usually better matches. And then finally, of course, crucially, the way we optimize these networks is with some kind of learning rule, backprop, for example. And what we think of as backprop is really a proxy to kind of efficiently get us to the adult state of the animal. So it's kind of like lumping together both the pressures of natural selection, but also kind of developmental pressures that get us to the adult state of the animal that we're finally reporting from, and comparing the models, the responses to the brain responses against. And it's this confluence of these four factors of task, architecture, learning rule, and data stream that gives rise to our artificial neural network whose response patterns we compare to the brain, usually by linear regression or other kinds of measures. And then quite crucially, what happens is that many of these models kind of fall by the wayside, not all of them work. And the ones that remain allow us to kind of iterate and refine our hypotheses going forward to improve that alignment. And so we can kind of think of this as like this process as basically designing machine learning algorithms that are optimized to perform an organism's behavior under the constraints that that organism faces. And it kind of yields two things. One is a quantitatively accurate and kind of practically useful brain model. The reason for that is now that we have something that we've kind of validated against that predicts brain activity well, it's this kind of like in silico copy, so to speak, of this brain area. And so now what we can do in principle is run much more cheaply and a lot high throughput various other kinds of experiments and perturbations on this artificial system to generate predictions for what might happen or kinds of next experiments if we wanted to in this biological system where this is far more costly to do. So in some sense, that's one of the kind of visions here. And the other one, of course, is that you can actually backprop through these networks and generate optimal stimuli that can perturb real neural responses. So just having this kind of like forward function is super useful by knowing that it can actually like predict brain data well as a way to generate new hypotheses much more cheaply than in biological system. And then you would go and validate those, of course, in the biological system. I'm going to focus less on this aspect of things, but just kind of keep it in mind. The other aspect, I think, which I'll primarily focus on, is this notion of like, understanding better principles of why neural responses are as they are. In other words, if we're optimizing a neural network for a task, we can think of it as our hypothesis for what we think are a summary of the evolutionary pressures of that brain area over the course of say millions of years of evolution. So in particular, in the visual system, that being good at supporting behaviors like object categorization and recognition are going to be important, at least say for the first 150 milliseconds of IT visual processing. That would be, say, one example of such a principle, and I'll show you a lot more as we go through the talk. And one of the reasons why we focus on challenging ecologically relevant tasks, so tasks that involve natural images or tasks that we might be interested in robotics as well, is in part due to this notion of the contravariance principle, which was kind of nicely articulated in an article by Rose Chow and Daniel Yeomans at Stanford like a few years ago, where the basic idea is that the harder the task is, the more challenging the task that your neural network is trying to solve, the less the number of kind of different ways to solve it there might be. So in particular, if a task is easy, there may be lots of different possible ways to solve it. If a task is harder, like for example, building like a fully autonomous robot that walks and talks and moves around the world like we do, of which there's zero solutions at the moment, then we can imagine that we have a higher probability of overlap with the brain. So the reason why we're seeing this alignment as we optimize for more challenging tasks between brains and models is because there's fewer solutions, and therefore we have a higher probability, it's not always guaranteed, but a higher probability of overlap between the two things, just because there's smaller possible solutions in that constrained set. And now that's the neuro-AI version, this contravariance principle. Another way to say it is, I'm sure, is like the AI version of this, which probably many of you have seen, is the Platonic representation hypothesis. Again, that if there's a lot of different, if the tasks are hard enough, there's fewer solutions that can solve a range of those tasks. And the brain is in that set. So you're ensuring, it's just by a counting argument, you're ensuring a higher probability of overlap. And then another way I kind of like this quote of summarizing this is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Another related one is nothing in the brain makes sense except in the light of behavior. And maybe our version of this is nothing in maybe computational neuroscience or systems neuroscience makes sense except in the light of task optimization. It kind of gives us a normative reason for why we think these response patterns are there by optimizing for this task and showing that as in held out test set that there's alignment between models and brains. One natural question though before we get started is like, what even counts as good here when we do this model brain alignment? So in particular, we can always assume, we kind of make this implicit assumption that model to brain alignment, like the best possible thing you could do is get to 100% explained variance of the neural responses. However, this isn't necessarily true in practice. Oftentimes, even between two brains, giving them the same exact conditions and the same exact stimuli, they can actually have a lot of variability, just simply due to the fact that like evolution produces lots of different instances of the same thing. And so we want to kind of capture that notion that it's not always perfectly 100%, that we want the models to match the brain as well as two brains match each other. And so this was this, I guess, position article, you could call it, was this thing we called the Neuro AI Turing test, where, in the kind of classic Turing test, right, it's just at the level of behavior. It's just at the level of the outputs, right? You want to talk to your chatbot, and your chatbot convinces you it's human, just as any other human could convince you, right? But in the Neuro AI version of this, we don't only want to look at behavior, but we actually care about the internals of the models matching the brains, as well as two brains match each other. So basically, throughout this talk, this kind of brain-to-brain similarity measure is going to be a kind of upper bound that we're going to look to try to get closer and closer towards as we're doing this model brain alignment. Now, furthermore, nowadays, we're kind of in an era of like large scale neuroscience. So this is a rodent brain with neuropixels in it. And we're increasingly getting whole brain data, not just brain data from one brain area or just a few neurons, but from awake behaving animals across their entire brain. And so this kind of gives us another kind of reason to want to do this kind of program, because the way we're going to have to understand this data is by kind of understanding normatively what the response patterns were optimized for. In other words, if I can summarize the response patterns of hundreds of thousands of neurons in just three things, a task, an architecture, and a data set, then that to me is a kind of formal understanding, at least of the normative reasons why the response patterns are as they are. And so in particular, the thing we're going to do here is basically build embodied agents. We're going to construct embodied agents and check if their internals pass the Neuro AI Turing test on whole brain data. So in other words, we're going to check, do those internals of the models, by doing more and more challenging tasks, match whole brain data up to how two brains match each other. And the type of question, kind of scientific question overall, that we're going to try to assess with this reverse engineering program is kind of a more basic question of like, how does the brain build and use world models? And I kind of like to think of world models as having four components: representation, prediction, planning, and action. And we can kind of think of this as like basically building up an agent where you perceive the world, you predict future states, you use those to plan, and then you take your plans and actually execute them in your actual embodiment. And we can kind of think of these as hypotheses, these individual modules as hypotheses for individual brain areas. So here I'm just showing you a rodent brain, and it's color-coded by just a brain area that might be hypothesized to actually match it up to the animal-to-animal similarity. And what we're going to do is basically apply this kind of technique throughout this talk. And we're going to kind of build this agent from the bottom all the way up. And by the way, just to mention, this kind of sensory motor loop is not something that's restricted to rodents. It's something we all share, right, with other species as well. So what I'm going to show you is a lot of cross-species comparisons and data. And in particular, you can kind of look at data from macaques, from rodents, even human behavioral data, and actually start to do comparisons between these by building embodied agents for each of these and showing where are the constraints, where are the objective functions between these modules similar and different, and therefore what are the differences and similarities of the evolutionary constraints between these brain areas. So it allows us to kind of get into more detail of how reverse engineering natural intelligence more broadly. So just for the first part of the talk, I'm going to start with, so I'm going to basically go from here all the way to here. I'm going to kind of build up this agent. And we're going to just start with the represent part, with the kind of perception aspect of things. So from an AI point of view, one of the challenges in the last, say, 5 to 7 years, not only just with building better vision models, but also with building better vision systems that better aligned with the brain, was this kind of supervision problem. So I talked about, at the time, ImageNet categorization as being a way in which we train vision networks to end up aligning with visual cortex. But the problem is that those require about 1,000 labels, right, across millions of images, and there's just no way that creatures receive kind of millions of semantic labels during labeling. So it might be an effective proxy for the type of task that visual cortex might be evolved to do, but just the way in which we get those labels is kind of deeply wrong in some way. So you can see, for example, this baby, which I'll show you again towards the end, is kind of just going about the world, exploring and interacting with it, and nobody's telling it or writing in the sky like, oh, this is this is a cube, this is a toy, this is a rubber duck, etc. It's just kind of getting that mostly through interaction, as well as playing with the world without this kind of like directed way. And so back about I think 5 years ago now, people were starting to make progress on better self-supervised learning for vision, in particular with contrastive learning tasks. And these were markedly better than what had come before it, such as with like visual encoders, where the high-level idea was to make these representations non-trivially robust to data augmentation. So in particular, as positive examples, he said different views of the same image should be considered the same image, and they should be pushed apart from different images, from images, say, of cats versus different images of the same dog. And you can kind of think of this approach of having positive and negative examples as somewhat inspired by how we might sample the world via head motion. I might look at this and I would consider these different views of this water bottle as the same object, and I would kind of contrast it with this, for example. But at a very high level, it has that similarity, not in any detailed way. And what we found was that if we took these kind of contrastive self-supervised models and compared them to macaque visual cortex, just as we did before, we found that the models with the contrastive objectives were matching the supervised models just as well. So in other words, we could remove that kind of proxy for a categorization label by having this contrastive objective. Now, in this case, at least in the case of matching to primate visual cortex, we're matching the response patterns equally well as the supervised model, right? We're not doing much better. And in fact, one argument you can make is that perhaps primate visual cortex is like a lot more object-oriented, and so therefore having the labels or even semi-supervising on the labels is actually not a terrible proxy. But we could ask, like, what about other species? Are there kind of cross-species differences? For example, with rodents, where you can imagine that having a self-supervised objective where you don't have labels might end up being potentially even a better representation than the categorization objective. It might be more general across species as an objective than just in the primates alone. And so we had work a couple years ago that looked at this, and what we found was that in mouse visual cortex, so this was these were recordings done by the Aran Institute, you could already look just like anatomically at mouse visual cortex. You don't even have to do any comparisons. You can already tell there's probably going to be some functional differences. One of them is that primate visual cortex is quite hierarchical, whereas mouse visual cortex is quite literally like a paw, where like V1 is the largest kind of area, and then you have a bunch of higher order areas that come out in parallel. And so it's not only shallower, but it just seems to be like doing other, like it just looks functionally different. But we can actually test this hypothesis. And what we found was that, if we compare the neural productivity of models, this is a function of their layers. So you take the best matching layer and vary the objective function of contrastive versus, say, supervised and categorization, where you're matching the kind of visual acuity of the animal and these other kind of things, and the depth of the animal's visual cortex as well. That even at the level of the objective function you choose, the contrastive objectives across these different mouse brain areas better match visual cortex of the rodent over the supervised objective. So unlike in the primate where they're equal, in the rodent case, the contrast objective is actually better. And this is about 90% of this kind of animal-to-animal consistency on this data set that we can get to. One question we wanted to ask though is like, why might this be? You know, this objective function at the end of the day wasn't invented with mouse visual. It's just something to do better at without doing vision and perception better without having labels. So why might this be better predicting something like mouse visual cortex? Our hypothesis here was that what this objective function allowed you to do was to basically learn a bit more of a task general representation rather than a more specialized one, with the kind of restricted resources that the mouse visual cortex has. In other words, of a much shallower visual cortex, less neurons, for example, as well than the primate, and also less hierarchical with lower visual acuity as well. So rodents see less well as part of this, but they still have to do well enough to. The way we did this was we actually took our trained self-supervised visual encoder, and we froze its weights and then dropped it into doing this new task on new images, but to do this kind of reward-based navigation behavior that maybe a rodent would be capable of performing. And in particular, we didn't just approximate how the rodent would do this. We actually took a body that was pencil back. This visual cortex says learn policy with this rodent body from a first-person view as it's going through the maze, and it has to get these blue orbs in order to get reward as it navigates the maze. And so from an RL point of view, it's about 38 controllable degrees of freedom, so it's a reasonably high degree of freedom, and it's just a different task, different set of images, but it also has to do other things with its visual cortex. It has to keep track of history over long time scales with these continuous inputs, in addition to learning a controller for this body. And what we found was that compared to the same exact architecture, same exact matched visual acuity, but just varying the loss function, that the contrastive models transferred better on this reward-based navigation task than the categorization specialized models. And furthermore, you could kind of go in the reverse direction and test task generality. You could kind of train in the maze environment where supervised now means you're training on the RL rewards to train your visual encoder. And then you could kind of test it on other held out new visual scene understanding tasks at the same visual acuity, et cetera. And you can show that across all of these, again, the kind of contrastive objective trained model generalizes better. A natural question we can ask, though, is that, do we need to restrict ourselves to vision alone? And in particular, you can say, well, look, at the end of the day, vision isn't the only, and in fact, definitely not the dominant sensory modality for rodents, right? There's olfaction, there's tactile sensing, et cetera. And so we kind of wanted to look at this to see if these principles also emerged in other sensory modalities beyond vision. And so we actually just had this work accepted as a nurse oral this year. And in particular, what we're doing is we're trying to build task optimized networks for tactile processing. And this was led by my students, Trinity and Yuchen. And the reason why we focused on tactile is that tactile data, just from a kind of like an AI point of view, at least, is also just very useful in manipulating occluded and out of distribution objects. So visually occluded objects, it's useful to get this kind of feedback as well. And we're at a stage, at least in robotics and AI, where tactile hardware and simulation is starting to get better. It's not fully there yet, but people are kind of racing to do that. And nonetheless, it's still kind of considerably underexplored, not only in robotics, but also in neuroscience as well, understanding it computationally. So my student Trinity actually did a search on arXiv, and we found that there's only about 625 results that were tactile in it, and a lot more for vision. So it's certainly kind of like an more emerging area. But a lot of the approaches, at least in robotics, to looking at the tactile processing are kind of vision based rather than actually dealing with the types of inputs that we get. So instead of like force and torque based. So in particular, a lot of what folks do is something like gel sight, where you basically press onto the image and you get a depth map. And this is kind of very restricted because you only see one part of the object. You can't interact with it like you would with real tactile processing, which is very temporal. So typically when people do this kind of self-supervised vision tactile learning, they're really just doing vision learning, where the second vision part is just depth. And this is really a coarse approximation to true tactile inputs. And so what we wanted to do is try to interface with the kind of temporal and time-varying force and torque inputs that an animal would receive, and see if that one affects the ML algorithms that we have to develop for the problem, and two, if it improves model brain alignment to that kind of tactile brain area. And our hypothesis, again, in line with the contravariance principle that I showed earlier, is that model architectures that mimic this will yield better performance for tactile data. And so what we did was we actually, in simulation, we took a biophysically realistic whisker model that was developed by Mitra Hartman's group at Northwestern. And what we did was we generated a large-scale data set of many different 3D objects that kind of brushed past these whiskers and generate a time-varying sequence of forces and torques across the facial pad of this simulated rodent. One kind of thing that we faced from the get-go was like how to train. So in self-supervised learning, how you augment during training, how you augment the images is quite critical for performance of contrastive objectives. And we found that this was also obviously critical for tactile processing, and we had to actually do a few different things than you might do with, like, say, depth map based images. So we had some modifications to the standard augmentations, where we also keep track we preserve kind of temporal order and precedence, in addition to vertically and horizontally flipping the force and torques spatially across the pad of the mouse. And what we found was our tactile augmentations usually yielded better performance than the image augmentations. The type of models had to change a bit too. So one thing is that, of course, in the past 5 years, there have been a variety of now sequence models, right? Not just RNNs, of course, which are kind of old news, but things like state space models like S4, Mamba S4, as well as transformer-based architectures. And no one of these sequence models is universally dominant over any other one. And so to us, it was unclear which would end up being good or not. So what we did is we kind of set up this notion of an encoder, attender, decoder architecture, where we could kind of search the space of different sequence models altogether, where we could kind of select an encoder that was better at kind of low-level things. So like S4 is going to be better at these kind of low-level, closer to the input sequences, continuous sequences. And then once they got kind of processed to a more simple stage, we could kind of then throw an attender or not at that. And the equivalent version of this in space-based land is Mamba. And we could choose between these. And then we could vary the loss function as doing just the standard categorization, contrastive objective with the augmentations we found, as well as just another proxy of like autoencoding as well. And so this allows us to kind of swap out different choices of the encoder and kind of search through this architecture space by like preserving what each of these sequence models is like universally better at in general. And so we have it out if you want to try your own. It just sets up this kind of and by the way, we also had to set kind of vary the RNN a bit too, where it's kind of unrolling in time. So just like you would imagine a signal would propagate in time through cortex, it kind of goes one after the other. So we have to change the unrolling strategy to better match that as well. So our library supports this kind of more biologically unrolling strategy with feedbacks, as well as allowing you to vary and combine these different sequence models all together in this EAD architecture. Okay. The main takeaway is that, at least on this tactile recognition task, what we found was that the best kind of models were on this recognition task were those that had the conv-RNN, the kind of recurrent encoder over, say, other space-based based models, at least for this task. and furthermore having this kind of a tender layer in between them. And this is kind of good because like we know this brain area is actually highly recurrent too. So the fact that these kind of align, at least at an anatomical level, was kind of interesting that emerged. The other thing was then not only looking at task performance, but also neural performance, right? At the end of the day, we're doing this in a rodent, so we actually have some metasensory data that we can like go and validate the models that are doing this task optimized tactile recognition task. And the way we did it was, there was work by Chris Rogers who like released this data set where basically of convex and concave objects, and they're either near, medium, or far from the whisker of the animal. And we could simulate this kind of exactly in our setup, where we could do active whisking on these different objects and match the object type that was done in the experiment, and then pass those same inputs to our EAD models that we trained. And just to highlight, oh, by the way, a kind of common thing you'll see is there's lots of bars. Again, this is to kind of separate models, but I'll just kind of summarize the results for you. One is that this is kind of the neuro-AI Turing test, the kind of animal-to-animal consistency that we want to reach. And what we found was the models that closely approached that were these encoder-decoder architectures, in particular, models that have this kind of, again, convar encoder that we found. Now, one thing we want to do is further push down these models. So we hope in future data to have more stimuli to evaluate this with. But by and large, at least for this data set that we've looked at and tasks we trained on, we found that these recurrent encoder models outperform the SSMs and feed-forward models on tactile recognition, and they also best match neural responses in nostril cortex. And at least in this case, having the right contrastive objective, just like in the case that we saw with primate vision, matches the supervised model. So in other words, we can kind of, it's sort of a proxy for this kind of general purpose representation that we're talking about. So it's the same kind of objective function. So if we were to kind of maybe summarize in one line, maybe the takeaway from this representation part is that maybe some combination, across brain areas and across species, the kind of emerging theme that seems to be happening is that maybe the best matching perception models have a form of recurrence along with this, most crucially, this kind of contrastive self-supervised objective. So I'm just putting in question marks because that's so far what we found, and maybe that's the kind of common theme. Well, we don't just, but we don't, that's not enough, right? Like we don't just represent the world, we also can predict in it. And so this was work that I did a few years ago as a postdoc, kind of looking at future prediction as kind of another aspect as we're kind of building this agent up. And the idea is that basically, like you and I can look at these kinds of images, for example, these two ice blocks, one on the right and one on the left, and infer just on our knowledge of temperature that this ice block has been out longer, right? So this goes beyond just simply categorizing them, but like inferring semantic properties that we know based on how we think the world evolves. My cat will kind of predict whether this box will support her before she gets on. I can just by looking at these hats on a rack plan intervening actions of how I would do that. Right, so all of these kind of involve things that kind of go beyond just what's rendered in the pixels here. And it's not restricted to static scenes. It's also in dynamic scenes where if I show you this kind of fluid that's hitting this unknown object, you can probably infer that it was a staircase. So we can kind of fill in with this kind of mental simulation. And what we wanted to better understand is like, what are the kind of functional constraints that allow us to do this kind of future prediction across diverse environments? And so we tried out a variety of different models, and then we compared them both to human behavioral data, where they're predicting whether there's yes, no, objects will fall or not, as well as detailed recordings from Berdaj's Gary's group of monkeys playing a game of mental pong, where the ball goes behind the paddle and it has to kind of simulate the position of the ball. And I'll get into more detail about that, but that's just a high level picture. The main thing is that, what we want to do here is learn a kind of partial implicit representation of the world by performing a challenging vision task, and then leverage these dynamics to do explicit future prediction. And so you might ask, well, what vision task should we do? Well, we do far more than just engage with static images, which is kind of everything I've shown you thus far. And so around the time I started this project, Ego4D had just come out, where people wear head-mounted cameras and go about their day performing everyday actions. And they're collected from all around the world. And you can take the same exact contrastive objective that I was just showing you earlier, and rather than apply it to single frames, apply it across frames, across time. And what people had found back then was that these kinds of pre-training on this kind of video data set allows you to transfer better to various simulated environments. And what we found was that if we're kind of comparing the predictivity of our models to brain responses in macaques while they're playing this game of mental pong, that the models that were kind of trained to do video foundation model feature prediction rather than these static image settings were doing much better at predicting the brain data. And it wasn't enough to just pre-train on Ego4D alone. We actually needed to like future predict in that latent space as well. So it wasn't enough just to pre-train on a video data set. You have to learn to use that latent to predict the next thing. And furthermore, when we kind of compare across both neural predictivity of the macaque as well as the ability to match human behavioral patterns in richer 3D scenes, what we found was that the kind of model that kind of did the best across these data sets was the one that was exposed to the largest variety of egocentric video sources and that transferred best to other kind of held out embodied settings. But I'll argue that there's still like work to be done here. What we want to do is kind of climb up this and get to better models across this diagonal. And so I'm happy to talk offline about some thoughts to kind of reach that there. But so far, when it comes to future prediction, maybe some kind of latent future prediction so far seems to be most consistent with the human behavioral and detailed macaque neurophysiological responses that we're finding. But what about maybe the remaining modules, especially say in planning? Well, one thing we can kind of look at here is in this case rodents again, where we can have a top-down view of a rodent navigating an empty room. And what the red dots here are basically place cells in its hippocampus that are firing as it enters a particular location. So it has a map of space that's being formed in its hippocampus. And what we found was that not only are there, and of course it's well known that there's these grid cells which also are in medial entorhinal cortex that support this behavior, and they have this kind of regular kind of triangular shaped patterns that are very interpretable. But the problem is that while we might have nice mathematical theories for these grid cells, they constitute about like 2 to 3% of the entire population of cells. You have other cells which are about 10 to 12%, which fire at borders or environmental boundaries. They're called border cells. But by and large, most cells don't have an interpretable response profile as a function of space. And so it's unclear kind of like, do we have a kind of unifying account of what gives rise to the varying response patterns in this kind of planning area of the brain? Or are we just restricted to these grid cells, which are a small population and have very human interpretable language? And what we see is that if we train neural networks to just path integrate, you can get back this same distribution in neural networks of varying response profiles that develop in these RNNs that are path integrating velocities and positions. And it actually matters the type of objective that you use for path integration. So in particular, you actually need to integrate hippocampal-like place cells to do this. And one of the reasons for that is that the animal itself doesn't have supervised access to X and Y position. So just like we talked about the supervision problem in vision, in this case, we have to have this kind of proxy for ground truth position. And so this actually matters for getting this type of distribution. Okay. So now we talked a little bit about planning. I'm going to connect this notion of temporal integration that we just talked about, this path integration, with this kind of last portion of the module, this notion of like figuring out the intrinsic goals of the system. And I'll explain to you what I mean. But this is work that my student Reese led in collaboration with a few folks that's in NERVS this year. And what I'll show you, this will kind of build up to, is so far I've kind of talked about individual brain areas, and I've been kind of piecing together from the limited neural data we have, various interpretations. But this is actually the first autonomous agent that's trained to just do a task. It's not trained on the animal behavioral data, And you can actually check its internals and have it predict not just one brain area, but whole brain data. But just to kind of start with, one of the reasons why autonomy is hard, so going back to this baby picture interacting with its environment, is that we don't have well-defined goals that are here. And success isn't clear either, what that means, that we would normally have and optimize for in a machine learning context. In neuroscience, we've often kind of overtrained animals to do things. We haven't really looked at free-range task-independent behavior, though that's starting to change as we've gotten better recording technology. So in both neuroscience and AI, we've kind of neglected this. And unlike in games where RL has succeeded, where we have a nice, well-defined reward function, the environment itself doesn't have some reward function written down. It's somehow internally generated by the organism itself. And so one nice model animal for this, for studying this kind of like free-range behavior, is the larval zebrafish, where it has a transparent skull, so you can actually image it. And what folks at Julia and Misha Aran's group did was they had it basically tied up to virtual reality, where as it moved its tail, it started to move its environment as well, just like you would expect if it was in water. But then what they did is they cut this feedback loop, and the fish would notice that after a while, its actions weren't leading to changes in the environment, and so it would give up. So this is called futility-induced passivity. So it would give up, and then it would try again. And so this kind of is nice because it's an ecologically relevant environment. It's just swimming or not, and you can get full brain imaging off of this animal while it's doing this behavior, and it has a kind of clear behavioral readout of giving up and trying again. And in fact, just to show you what this looks like, this is like the whole brain of the zebrafish across time as it's doing its task. You can see the neurons light up, but they can also, which is kind of amazing that they did this, simultaneously image other cell types that typically aren't studied. They're non-neuronal. These are known as radial astrocytes, which they found was like important for kind of gating this behavior as well. So they can image these simultaneously in the whole brain. Now, to kind of connect with this work, we started looking at the kind of prior work in like intrinsic motivation or unsupervised RL. And what we found is a lot of them are very information theoretic objectives. They have to do with the notion of surprise. So their notion of exploring new states has to do with states that are ultimately information theoretically surprising. And this has been kind of applied to various kind of toy environments like Atari, Mario, DeepMind Control Suite. But when we kind of tried these surprisal models in a kind of like simulated zebrafish body, it would like not learn to swim at all. It was kind of like stuck in weird, unethological behaviors. And furthermore, in a more fundamental way, these approaches suffer from what's known as the white noise problem. In other words, if I converted this into a static, that would be information theoretically very surprising. So these types of agents would just fixate on this. But we know like animals and babies, et cetera, wouldn't find this very interesting, and they wouldn't spend all their energy on this and then unfortunately die in their environment as a result. So it seems like epistemic kind of curiosity isn't enough. So animal autonomy doesn't appear to just be novelty optimization. So what we did was we kind of incorporated prior. So we incorporated a memory, like if you remember the last section, of what it means to swim forward and make progress in your environment in that kind of model of the world. And then we track progress in that world model of the agent itself. And so we wanted to kind of build a kind of physically realistic body, as you've kind of seen before with the rodent work too, where we built like a body and a skin as well, and we trained these various objectives, including our own, with, and we actuated it. And so this is kind of like the first-person view of it, at least when it's tested. It's trained in a naturalistic environment. And it's primarily driven by its visual flow, by what it sees, its optic flow, as well as proprioceptory variables of its joint angles. And so altogether, the kind of zebrafish agent looks like this. It has a world model and has an intrinsic drive that's basically computing a notion of progress. This is formally what the notion is. It's just keeping track of, based on its current existing model of the world, how much the new model of the world is actually making progress with respect to that, and it's getting rewards with respect to that kind of disagreement over time. And it's kind of it's integrating over time. So this is kind of paralleling what we saw in the planning section of doing a kind of temporal integration across time. But now the difference is that it's doing the temporal integration through its learned world model of how to move forward and what it should expect normally. And so putting it all together, we can kind of, this is with the trained policy, you get a lot more naturalistic swimming with this kind of intrinsic motivation objective. Furthermore, you can compare not just the behavior of this animal, but the internals of our agent that's being trained here, and see that it both matches the model. The model matches the whole brain data almost to 100% of the explained variance compared to the other methods, the other episodic curiosity methods. And furthermore, it better matches the behavior of the fish as well, the swimming behavior of the fish in this experiment. And by the way, it's not fit to either of these directly. This is after the fact, after it's been optimized on this environment in a new held out setting. Okay, so where does this leave our little agent picture that we've been building up? So maybe perception, at least from what we're kind of piecing together, is some kind of recurrence plus contrastive self-supervised objective that yields a latent that we then can future predict on. And then we can kind of do this kind of planning via this kind of temporal integration of world model-based curiosity. So maybe it's this so far, and it seems relatively consistent with one another in kind of a coherent picture. But at the end of the day, I'm putting question marks here because this is all with brain data that's limited in various ways. But maybe what we're seeing is a kind of convergence across these different species in these different areas. So we're kind of Frankensteining things together. But more neural data is online, especially whole brain data. So we'll see how much of this picture remains or changes as time goes on. In my last minute or so, I kind of want to mention a few things there with regards to as we start to build more and more capable agents, maybe thinking a little bit about the safety implications. I think right now we don't have to worry about that with these types of agents. But I think it's worthwhile to think about what happens once we get there. Are there so I'm sure many of you have heard of the term AI alignment. And this is the idea of aligning AI with our values or with our goals, having the goals be aligned with human values. Now you might ask, well, what are human values at the end of the day? We don't all agree on what this is. One thing you can show, so I have two papers that are in AAAI this year. They're more theoretical, but they kind of study this alignment problem more broadly. And you can show kind of information theoretically that if you have too many of these intrinsic goals for your agent to optimize, then alignment will actually be intractable. And not just for agents today, but even computationally unbounded agents, agents that say take O one time to do everything. So deciding what these goals should be for alignment, and especially a small subset of these goals for agents to have, will be kind of critical just from a science of safety point of view, kind of different than everything I've kind of showed you so far. And this is the paper at the bottom here. Perhaps one small goal, I am optimistic that I think for a lot of deployments that we don't have to agree on all human values or all human ethics, but that we can kind of come up with a small subset of values that we can all agree on. And I think, for example, for a coding agent, it's just a few things that you would want the coding agent to do, right? It's not to solve morality, but it's to write clean code, write complete code, write functional code, and document it with unit tests. That's not too many things to specify. So I do think that in a lot of deployments, we won't run into this barrier. But another one that we can probably all agree on is avoiding human loss of control. That the AIs don't, in pursuit of a task objective, don't kind of override human action. So the canonical thought experiment is the paperclip maximizer, that it maximizes paperclips and it takes over the world's factories because it's better to do that in order to maximize paperclips. And that's the sort of thing we can probably all agree on universally is a set of values that we want to have. And this is known as corrigibility. And we can actually show that there exist small value sets that can guarantee this kind of corrigibility more formally as an optimal policy. And again, it's kind of lexicographic and modular, just like this picture. So it seems to be a useful inductive bias. So I think for things like loss of control, there exists kind of universal value sets that are quite small that avoid this kind of main alignment barrier. I think an open question is, can we scale this cost effectively? So this is something we're working on. But both of these papers are kind of related. They'll both be in AAAI this year, and there's more details in each of these. I'm happy to answer questions. The last thing I want to mention is the reason why I said, can we make this more cost effective, is that if we wanted to generate economic benefit from AI, especially if it does yield say, the need for loss of jobs for a lot of folks, or if we want to be able to generate it from AI rents alone or something like that. A natural question is that the cost of running and operating AI will play an important role, especially aligning AI. I did some economic analysis here too, which is under review. You can see the paper here. But the main thing is that you can actually derive a nice closed form threshold for like when, even in the worst case, and you don't have to assume that all jobs are automated or anything like that. You can just base it on current economic parameters of which jobs would be automated. For AI to be capable enough to generate enough of a margin to, say, fund something like universal basic income or some other thing like that, you can actually, this dotted line is actually the analytic threshold that's needed minimally to allow for this. And so something like 5 to 7 times existing automation is how much more efficient AI would be. So it doesn't have to be 50 times or 100 times, it's actually quite small. And this is reasonably achievable even on like slow timescales of like, if we think AI's capability will double every 10 years, by something like mid-century is reasonably achievable as a forecast. Of course, these numbers can change depending on what you put in, but this is based on current data, and you can kind of look at the sources here with code. The main thing though is the analytic formula, and that kind of tells you what are some of the factors that impact this threshold and make it go higher and lower. And the main one seems to be that the cost, the alignment cost, easily drives up this threshold. So making the operating cost of AI cheaper will be important. And if aligning it is too costly, then its deployment will be restricted, and its impact on society in terms of generating these kinds of benefits will also be limited as well. A natural question is like, how can we ensure this beyond just like loss of control, like things like other terms of well-being, which I'll just leave as an open question. But I'll just end on that. And with that, I'd like to thank my lab, who does all the great work, and as well as my funding sources, and thank you for having me here.